Well, we are officially getting started here, and we're logged on to YouTube's stream. We're good. Do we know how many people are there?
Not yet.
All right.
I can look.
Well, hello everybody out there. For those of you that are new here, I'm Joe Francis, president of DOS. I think my main qualification there was they needed a president, and I didn't say no. There are many more qualified birders in this audience than me. I want to introduce a newcomer to DOS and to this meeting, Lenore, if you just want to say hello.
Hi, I'm Jeannie. I'm looking forward to birding with you all.
And Lenore comes from many years birding with New Jersey Audubon. So we're going to show her all this. And I want to make sure that Lenore and Andy link up because she wants to know about the bird line, and she lives in Old Newcastle, doesn't know and needs to know about the Hermitage.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I think the next part on the agenda, I want to ask Carolyn to give us an update on the coming trips. Just hold that.
Good evening, everyone. We have quite a few opportunities coming up for winter birding, so bundle up and get ready. And as always, you can find details to meeting places and details about the field trips on our website. Okay, Andy wants to talk about the White Clay Creek bird survey. I told you it was first up.
Do I need to come up there and talk, or do I?
Yeah, for this.
You probably do it with the microphone.
Okay. Which line is the microphone?
You just have to hold it.
Yeah, just hold it.
Okay, so the big question is are we going to have the bird walk on Saturday? And the last I heard was the storm's not going to hit until Saturday night. So the word is it's on. It might be a little cold, so wear your mucklucks. And right now, we've only done 3 censuses so far, and already we're seeing some pretty interesting changes have occurred. Tremendous number of sapsuckers. We've had 15 sapsuckers a trip, and we had 15 sapsuckers total in 2 years on the previous census back in 1976. Lots of pileated woodpeckers right now, and I know pileated woodpeckers are increasing in numbers, but a lot of that is also because the woods have grown up from where it used to be DuPont private land. And the number of purple finches has just been outstanding. So we've had double digit of purple finches every time we've been out. So looking for those new birds. We're up to 50 species. Added raven last week to the census, and hopefully we'll get a lot more. We're meeting right now at the Hopkins Bridge parking lot at 8 o'clock in the morning, and when the spring warblers start coming through, we'll probably move that up to earlier time, and we might be meeting in different spots. So stay tuned. If you want to be on our mailing list, just give me your name. If I've got your email, I'll send you emails about it whenever you need it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Next up is Joe's walk at the late afternoon walk, and it has been rescheduled because of the snowstorm coming up, the forecasted snowstorm. So it's on Saturday instead of Sunday, the 31st of January. It's a good time to be looking for sparrows there. You can find fox sparrows, and last year Joe found a rare LeConte sparrow. Also rusty blackbirds can be seen there.
It's a good place usually for rusties.
Yeah.
The ground's not frozen.
Oh, right, it's gonna, and then 2 feet of snow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's that. And then we have a new walk with Mo Crone at the C&D Wildlife Area at Canal Pond. Will is a grad student at UD. He spoke to us in December about his studies with purple martins. And he also has volunteered at the Hawk Watch on David Brown's days off. and now we've roped him in to help lead the trips. So this one is from 9 to 10, although Will said he's willing to possibly go to other nearby hotspots if participants are interested and there's time allows. So like possibly going to Augustine Wildlife Area. Anything, let's see. This trip will be rescheduled if the pond is completely frozen, and I will put a statement on the website, and we usually get to send out emails to DOS members in the event of cancellations. So just be looking for that. And then Amy O'Neill has the second in the series at Harry's Pond. She started this seasonal series this year. In October, we found 38 species at the pond, including a late northern rough-wing swallow. So we're waiting to see what we'll find in the winter. Some ducks, possibly hooded mergansers and ringneck ducks. Pardon? Oh, Gadwall, okay. So you know, yeah.
And he had Baltimore Oriole too recently.
Oh my gosh, I didn't see that.
In the cedar trees.
That's amazing.
No. It's coming.
Oh, that one also would be rescheduled if the pond is frozen. So just watch for that. And then, Andy, well, before we talk about this one, Andy's going to talk about, we don't have details for it yet, but Andy is planning a trip for Sunday, February 15th.
Right.
And he's going to talk about that.
I'll talk from back here.
Okay. Oh, what do you need?
It's the 15th.
Just speaking for your.
Thank you. It's the 15th, and I had to check that is not Super Bowl weekend. It's the weekend after the Super Bowl, so we'll have our own Super Bowl. The trip is going to be to Barnegat and Brigantine. And we're going to go to Barnegat. That's a good spot for harlequin ducks and common eider. And there's been one king eider, a female, but it's a king eider still there right now. And then we'll go on down to Brigantine, which Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, and kick around there. And hopefully we'll be on the road and home shortly after dusk. Plan is to meet 7 in the morning at the at the Claymont train station.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Finally, I'm just going to mention this one because it comes up very quickly after our next meeting. This is Jim White's annual trip looking for raptors in winter. It's very popular and it is limited to 14 DOS members only. There are still 6 as of this morning, still 6 spots available, so please email Jim if you're interested to join that one. That's a day-long trip all over Delaware. And that's all I have. Now, Jessica was going to talk about the youth birding.
Alright, so we were supposed to have one this Sunday. Obviously that is canceled. But our next one is also February 15th to Port Mahon, looking for ducks. So if you know any youth birders who want to join a fun group, send them our way. We do have full spring schedules printed out that are on the front table that you can hand out to whoever. We also have a printout of our new scholarship application as well, so you can grab one and pass that off to whoever as well.
Jessica, thank you. And I just want to give brief heads up on a couple of meetings. February, 3rd Wednesday, we'll be meeting here. It will be the Christmas bird count update, and I need to get in touch with area coordinators, but we'll set it up as we have done before.
What did you just say?
Christmas bird count.
Not February 3rd.
No, 3rd Wednesday. Third Wednesday of
And
February.
it's on Zoom.
I actually had, well, should we do it on Zoom? Because I had told Glenn that we could do it here. Last year we did it on Zoom because the weather was forbidding, and also it was early and people needed time.
No, schedule on Zoom.
What do you think, Mike? Should we keep it on Zoom because people
Well,
have
that's the
seen?
way it is already on the website, so I think we should stick
Okay.
with that. And I think the idea is, again, that we've got compilers from all over the state, so that way everybody can
Okay,
participate.
fair enough, fair enough. If we could reach agreement on virtual versus in person, we would be in great shape. And this is a transition segue. In March, third Wednesday, I forget which is the date, we will be meeting at the Delaware Museum of Nature and Science. Matt Haley is doing a presentation. He hasn't given me the title yet. I want him to call it something like,
It's on the website.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay,
He
good.
gave me all that stuff.
oh, okay, he didn't copy me, shame on him. I wanted to call it, and Pittenac's Remystified.
Yeah.
And-
He called it Flycatcher Problems,
Yeah,
and it's March 18th at the museum.
so to give you all a heads up, you'll be hearing more of this in March. What we want to do is to shift our face-to-face meetings towards the Delaware Museum for several reasons. Number one is there are things you can do there that you can't get on Zoom, and that'll attract people to the in-person meetings. You'll be able to actually see specimens. They're putting a new area for meeting. They had a very small auditorium that seated about 50, gets crowded very quickly. They're going to have seating for about 100 with a very nice projection system there. We hope by then. And we're also, you're dealing with somewhat better roads, easier access to the main highways. We hope that's going to attract people that are coming from a bigger distance because the windy roads to Ashland can sometimes be for bidding as well as for boating. But more on that to follow. And of course, we're also planning to have associated with that some opportunities for meals and libations, pre and post meeting in the general area between Centerville and Greenville. There are a lot of opportunities not far from the museum. So stay tuned for more. Matt's been working very hard with the director of the museum, Andy Santiago, who's quite interested in a stronger relationship with DOS. So we're very pleased. And they're doing a number of other things. They have a bug room there where they can compare skeletons, and we're going to have a bug room cam where you can see time lapse the little bugs cleaning the skeletons. It's fascinating, and the one they have at the Field Museum gets more hits than the Falcon cam in Chicago, which I find amazing. But it is interesting, and they also have a tie into the youth community through their parents, and might be bringing in some audiences that we've not always been able to tap into if you're not already a birder. So that's what's coming up in the months ahead. And what I do want to do is going to be a two-part introduction. I really was delighted to get a hold of Kat Christie. You may remember we had a call for volunteers for the Delaware Shorebird project that came out a little late last year, and we had to turn people away because it had already filled. There will be a call for volunteers related to this today, and no one's going to be turned away because we're just getting started on this one. The Delaware Shorebird project has been going on for so long. It's just been documented in the 2025 issue of the Ornithologist, and I thought, since Sally has so much knowledge and background and involvement in this, Sally, you're going to introduce Kat. Come on up. And while you're introducing her, I'm going to swap computers.
I was told I was doing the introduction as I walked in, so I haven't done much prep. Kat Christie has been involved with the Shorebird project since July of 2023 when she moved to Delaware to take over, and she is now the project director for this really wonderful Shorebird project, which has been going on in Delaware since the 90s. It's not a lot is known about it, but it's an international team of scientists who come to Delaware Bay to study the shorebirds here. And on Jersey, there's another team doing the Jersey route, but Delaware's been quite involved, and she's in charge. Kat got her master's in University of Georgia, and she has been a great leader of the Springtime group, managing people who've come from all over the world and all over the United States to be a part of it. And I've felt very fortunate and honored myself to be a volunteer for many years. And it's been nice getting to know Kat, and thank you for coming.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Oops, you need this.
Yes, please. Let's see if I can make it all work where I want it to. Thank you very much, Sally, and everybody for joining online. It's nice to get to talk to you all. Sorry for all the confusion last year, but maybe this will help teach you all a little bit more about what we're up to and several different ways that you could get involved if you were interested. So, as Sally mentioned, I'm the project lead for the Delaware Shorebird project. I joined NREC 2023, so I've now had 2 full field seasons with the spring migration under my belt, and we're getting ready for a third. Delaware Shorebird project is what we call this kind of ongoing partnership between NREC Division of Fish and Wildlife, some folks at parks, some folks at fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, and then critically, our partners at the UK's Wash Wader Research Group, which is also, decades old shorebird banding and research effort over in the UK in an estuary called the Wash. That's also a vital migration stopover and foraging area for a lot of these very similar species that we get here. So way back when the project was first being started, biologists with teams needs attention. NREC, Fish and Wildlife Service, and researchers, oh goodness, hold on a minute. You all don't need to see my teams. Got together with researchers in the UK to kind of move some of the strategies that they were using to study shorebirds in the UK and apply them to the Delaware Bay shorebird stopover. So if you want a little more detail on kind of the project inception and how it all works, there's a great article that just got written about all that. If you're not familiar with the area or you're relatively new here, you might be curious why this, extensive shorebird program is going on here in Delaware. A lot of you have probably heard about this before. Delaware is a globally important stopover location for a lot of shorebird species. This, unfortunately, is like the worst graphic because on the satellite or the Migration Bird Explorer, the shorebird color is yellow, which is the hardest to read. But if you can barely make out the different little piles of spaghetti situation going on, you can see there's a really dense one right where we live. Part of that effect on this map, to be honest, is because we put a lot of satellite tags on birds, and that's what this map is showing, but we put the tags out because there's so many birds here. And if you're also clocking that a lot of these migration routes seem to span the whole hemisphere, that's also, a big component of what's going on here is some of our birds, such as the rufous red knot, travel all the way from areas like the southern tip of South America up to breed in the Canadian Arctic, and a huge proportion of that population stops here, practically in our backyards, in order to fuel that journey. The reason we are such an important stopover location for these birds is our horseshoe crab spawning event that goes on each spring. So Delaware Bay is also a global phenomenon as far as horseshoe crab spawn, and that is what these birds are queuing into. Over an evolutionary timescale, a lot of these populations have evolved to time their migration with arriving in the Delaware Bay around the same time our horseshoe crab spawning is peaking. So these eggs that you can see sort of in this image, it's all those kind of greenish spheres in with the horseshoe crabs. When they get exposed by wave action and other things on the beach, they become available then for shorebirds to eat, and they provide a really high protein food source to fuel these birds as they're going on an absolutely insane athletic endeavor of flying across the length of the globe. So they make part of that journey. A lot of them stop here, fatten up, some of them nearly double their weight, and then continue that last leg of their migration up into the Arctic, and then that food source also starts to fuel them for the initial part of the breeding season, which is an energetically taxing thing for any species, with things establishing territories, mating, maintaining a nest. All of that is taxing on a bird, and so they fatten up here to kind of get them through that period. Another critical part of this story and leading to the Delaware Shorebird Project forming is a massive population crash that occurred in the late 90s, or mainly early 2000s, kind of just as we were figuring out just how unusual the Delaware Bay was in terms of shorebird populations and migration behavior. We suddenly started to see those numbers dropping. This was associated with an overharvest in the horseshoe crab fishery in the 90s that led to a rapidly decreasing horseshoe crab egg density and availability for the birds. Subsequent catastrophic declines in red knot and a lot of other species. It's not necessarily that they would, come here and then starve and we were just seeing massive fatalities. It was sneakier than that. It's that because the birds are coming here to fatten up to fuel for another life stage, they were coming here and not getting adequate food, not necessarily either making it to the breeding grounds or maybe not being successful, maybe just not choosing to return to this area. So it took a little longer time to figure out what was going on because what we were just seeing is fewer birds coming back, not necessarily that we were able to see such a direct impact. So once all that kind of started getting put together, it led to a worldwide conservation effort with relation to the horseshoe crab fishery and shorebirds. It started in the Delaware Bay and has spread to a global effort. Now when you go to shorebird conferences and research, that's happening hemisphere-wide, worldwide, but some of the first sites that were considered shorebird reserves were in Delaware and New Jersey. So that led groups like New Jersey State Fish and Wildlife and Delaware State to start to work together and work with outside biologists to figure out both how to study what we do have and how to get, progress towards recovery in this really fragile system. What we do in that project has, changed over the years, but I'm going to go over sort of the current status of what our work out there is. It's a kind of complicated multi-step process out there, so I've just included some highlights, sort of starting from the bottom, building towards maybe the most basic, towards what we apply it for. So we do surveys around the coast of the bay, just counting flocks, counting species, understanding individual distributions, things like that, anything that you would normally associate with a survey. Additionally, we also do an 2 to 3 days every May, there's an aerial survey that flies the perimeter of the bay and gets one snapshot count, and that's part of our survey process. We also band and flag birds, so individual USGS numerical medal bands, as well as field readable flags that you're able to individually identify birds from a distance with just a camera, scope, sometimes even binoculars if your eyes are really good. So we capture and flag a lot of birds each year to help maintain our ability to think about populations as a whole through collecting different individual metrics on birds, such as weights, measurements, and then once we have those flags on, we're able to get individual data on that bird as far as, where they go next, how long they survive, and all these things. That then if you multiply them over the thousands of birds that we've put flags on and collected data on consistently over years and years, you can then start to draw population level conclusions, which is another part of our big mission here, is to then be able to take these individual data points that we get here and apply them to understand the species as a whole, the Delaware stopover subset of that species in a given year. Some of that's through population modeling, some of that is through relative weights compared to previous seasons, survivorship or return rates across seasons, and overall that just contributes to a better understanding of this system. We'll take a kind of closer look at what all these things are. So we have just included here a map of some of our sites on the Delaware coast of the project, because this is run by the state on this side and by by New Jersey on the other side, we only deal with the sites we can drive to from my office. So we visit each one of these sites at least once every 3 days through our survey period, which goes from May 1st to June 3rd every year. We complete a couple of different days of aerial surveys where a plane leaves from New Jersey and flies the whole perimeter of the bay, counting red knot and turnstone. We complete a couple of those each year. Those we're aiming to get a peak count. We try to aim for when we think some of the most shorebirds are going to be around based on previous year's data to understand in a single day, what are some of the highest numbers of birds we're able to support in the bay. Part of what we're doing on these surveys is collecting our mark to unmark ratios, which is a big part of a lot of mark resighting studies. So when we've got flags or bands out in a population, we know how many flags we've put out. If we're also collecting hundreds of these, you know, in a flock of, in our project, 50, what percent of them had flags, and we know how many flags we've put out, that can get incorporated into a model to make conclusions about the overall population size and how it changes year to year relative to your previous ratios. We do these more intensive data collection efforts for these 5 study species. These are the birds that we get that are most commonly being banded and flagged either by us or by other people. So that's where we concentrate our effort, is where they're getting individual markers. We try to contribute as much resighting data both to our own banded birds and other projects as possible. So that's red knot, reddy turnstone, sanderling, semi-palmated sandpiper, and short-billed dowager. And all of those we'll apply flags to if we catch them, except the semi-palmated sandpipers. That's just not part of our protocol, but a lot of other neighboring projects do put individual markers on those birds. Most of our survey effort is focused around Mispillion Harbor in Slaughter Beach, which is the pink area there. That's an Army Corps inlet site that there's just a lot of nice shallow beaches, several facing different directions, and that's just where we get the most horseshoe crab spawning and then the most shorebirds. In recent years, birds have become increasingly concentrated there in a way that, as a conservation person, I don't really love. We want to have more network of varied and valid sites. But in recent years, all we know is that Mispillion is critical to Delaware's value as a shorebird stopover. So I mentioned all those target species, and you're all bird people. You can probably see all of our different species highlighted here, but this was the only picture I could find that I think we had absolutely all of them in there. But in a slightly hard to read color coding method here, we've got our turnstone over on the far side, red knot, and the one pretending to be a red knot behind it when you're just looking at their chests in a giant flock. The short-billed dowager can be really annoying with that really pretty orange chest, but if you're trying to get a red knot count, it can be a little tough when you're looking at, 3,000 birds. The semi-palmated sandpiper and the sanderling next to each other there, which look very similar, depending on their stage of their plumage, but the size difference is considerable. And usually, luckily, we're looking at mixed flocks, and you can really tell the difference even from a distance there. And then our Dunlin, which we also get in large numbers. We don't necessarily consider them a full-on target species because no one is doing big individual marking efforts with them, but we still collect general count data that we can then compare over years, even if we're not able to get individual resighting metrics. Here's a look at just what a typical water's edge on a Mispillion beach looks like for weeks at a time in May. You can see it's a dense flock, mixed species. Our surveys, sound simple enough, but they do take a lot of effort and training just because this is, a couple of feet of beach in one area. Observers really need to be able to get quick counts, accurate counts, understand how to extrapolate. For a flock like this that's dense, what we typically recommend is people will get the approximate percentage makeup for a lot of different species in here, taking into account their size, and then, use unit clumping to guess about how many birds are on a beach, and then sort of do the math from there, because actually sitting down and counting, a mile of beach that look like this, you're not going to be able to do that one bird at a time. So we put a lot of training in with our volunteers to try to get these extrapolated flock counts as consistent as possible. And either way, we just figure with that amount of training, even if the counts aren't perfect person to person, they are going to average out to a reasonable conclusion about our flocks at each of these different sites. So the next part of our project I wanted to talk about was banding and flagging, and I'll see if I can pull up this video without making everything angry. Let's see. It's on Facebook, which is probably not the best. So this is going to be a slow motion video of a cannon net firing, and cannon nets are what we use to capture our shorebirds during this project, because we're able to capture huge amounts of birds at once while they're in like a foraging situation. A lot of other times when you're trapping birds, we're not dealing with territorial birds with nests and things like that. These birds wouldn't necessarily be super friendly with mist nets. This is the method that the folks from that British group have found most effective. So here is just a slow-mo of that net kind of firing and settling over a flock. So you can see the birds start to move, but the angle is calculated pretty carefully to try to make it so that we're catching the birds and kind of forcing them back down, but all the tension is at the edges. So that net is, I mean, I'm sure they're not having the best day of their lives, but it's not slamming them down into the ground. It's not super stiff. You can kind of see how loose that top is. So the edges are settling over the flock. Once the net is fully down, the birds are walking around freely under there. It's actually more of a hassle to get them out because they're usually, most birds, you know, unless the net is super crowded, are able to move around really freely underneath that thing. The Pit, nice ad. Everybody watch The Pit, it's a great show. Oh goodness, we'll have to skip ahead real quick. So those cannon net catches, we can catch huge numbers of birds at once. I don't know if you were there, Sally, for our big catch like 2 years ago. We ended up like 600 birds, and that was with releasing lots from the net. That was just the amount that we kept. And that was an exceptional catch, but not by a lot. Like several hundred is typical, and it's just a well-oiled machine once we get the net fired. For processing all these birds, we give ourselves a 3-hour time limit from the time the net is fired. The birds are kept in shade and as much calm and low stimulation as we can keep them. So some of these images, that's a better look at the cannons. So that's what those look like. They get that broad end gets buried underneath, and then it's a projectile stuffed into them and just black powder that's fired, and those shoot out and drag the edges of this big flat net out over a flock. There's plenty of times where this fails, because what you're trying to do is way ahead of time predict where a suitable flock of birds is going to be sitting several hours from now, because you're going to flush anything there during the long process of setting this up, and you need to get your whole team in place and ready to go out of sight, because we're setting up a big kind of base camp area like that. And you're just using the bird's behavior in recent days, you're using what we know about the tides and where the horseshoe crabs are gathering to try to figure out where the birds are likely to land. And then sometimes you have the problem of it's too many birds. If it's way too dense in there, we're not gonna risk injuring birds by firing on too big of a flock. So it's really a fun dance that you get to do for finding the exact conditions, and there's plenty of days where it fails. If any of you guys end up coming out this season, you also gotta be ready for sitting, waiting for a net to fire for hours and having to scrub it just because it's not gonna work that day. The birds keep it interesting. Once the net fires, if it's any level of sunny or hot out, we cover the net with a soft cloth over top so that birds aren't overheating during that time. The team rushes out to the front edge of the net and starts pulling birds out. You know, we all work from the same direction, working our way up the net. Birds get loaded into these covered boxes here that have some nice airflow at the burlap at the top. We get sorted by species to make sure that nobody's fighting too much or anything. And then they get carried from where the net was fired to an area that we've set up as our base camp, usually out of sight of the net so that we're not keeping birds away from our catching area with our own gear. Birds then get transferred to these larger runs where they have more than enough room to stand upright. We have specific caps for how many of each different type of species could go in a set container so that even when it's, you know, the fullest it'll ever be, they're still moving freely in there. We choose our materials so that there's solid airflow. They stay under this shade cloth, but it limits their visibility, so we're hoping they're not as stressed here as if they were seeing us all as clearly. And then the teams usually kind of assign different roles and get right to work in very efficient little groups that I'll show a couple images of later in the talk, but to get all of the banding and flagging done as quickly as possible, then they're carried out back to the beaches that they came from or as nearby as possible and released in clumps so that they're not necessarily being flown out one at a time. They're able to sort of cue in on each other's behavior. Typically, mentioned we have about a 3-hour limit, so we usually, if we don't think we're gonna make that based on the catch that we have pulled out of the net, we'll just release some of our non-target birds. We never wanna be pushing that limit too closely. Here's a look at what some of these field readable flags look like, both, you know, slightly further back and a more realistic look at a flock, and then with some of these really nice lenses and scopes. So these flags, we just started flagging Dowager for the first time this year, and they're so nice to read. These birds are so tall, they're so calm, So looking at a flag like this on this like very elegant little stilty bird walking through a flock taller than everybody else, dramatically different than looking at a semi-palmated sandpiper with a flag that's like 2/3 the size and with a single brain cell that just won't stop pinging off the sides of its skull. I love semis. So we've got a variety of different, code schemes. These were the first times we've put flags out on dowagers, so we start with kind of straightforward alpha codes. These are also being put out in New Jersey, so they have the first half of the alphabet, I believe, going out with David and Jay Audubon, and we had the back half of the alphabet. For Red Knot and things that we've run through the codes further, we've introduced things like symbols. So there's pluses, there's greater thans, there's all sorts of things. And actually for several species, Sanderling, Red Knot, and Turnstone, we've essentially run ourselves out of codes in these colors. The color schemes are decided on a hemisphere level with different colors assigned to different countries, and US is supposed to be light green. When we did start to run out of codes, we've transitioned and started putting out dark green flags with white ink and started over the code series, because that's how long this work's been going on, is that we just ran out of options that could go on a flag. Yeah, there's a highlighted flagged bird over there. You can just see that tiny bit of plastic sticking out the side of its leg, cue you in to look a little closer. So for these flags, every unique combination of species, color, code, that's an individual bird. If you get, Sanderling, dark green flag, 662, that is the only one. We know exactly when it was banded. It's in our records, it's individually identifiable from that.
Do you want us to report this if we see anything?
Yeah, so you can report these either to Bird Banding Lab, or there's a separate database that was created around the time that these projects originally started called bandedbirds.org that's more friendly to inputting flag codes, just because it was a database created with flags rather than other types of bands. But yeah, if you do recite things like this, putting them into one of those main databases, and then it'll get back to the project that put that out initially. So while we've got these birds in hand, in addition to just putting the flags and bands on, we collect a lot of individual metrics, both while we've got the bird in hand and then going forward. So these are a look at what some of our processing teams look like when we've got these birds. So typically it's, a scribe sitting at the center collecting data, and a semicircle of people who each have one job. They're either the bander, the processor, the head and bill measurer, or the weigher. And everyone's just got a bird in their hands, working through a circle until they're put into a release box. Each bird tends to spend a good processing team in the flow, like slightly under a minute in hand. So that's why we're able to process 600 birds, in a couple of hours with a relatively limited team, is these processing teams are usually hitting about a bird a minute when it's going well. So in addition to just kind of general physical metrics, we're able to put geolocators on at stages like this. So in recent years, we've been putting some satellite tags on to birds and able to detect local and larger hemisphere-wide movements. For some of our species, one of the coolest things that we figured out we were able to do is we collect feathers from our red knot, and based on the isotopes in the feather, the carbon-nitrogen ratios, we can tell where those feathers were grown and thus assign a wintering location to that bird. We can know whether it was a long-distance migrant or a short-distance migrant. It was proved that essentially birds that winter near Argentina have distinctly different feather isotopes than birds that winter in like Brazil and the Caribbean. And that just makes it so that we can take data that we collect in the Delaware Bay and apply it to more population level, high level things. So if we've got, say in an average year, we have about half our red knot are long distance migrants, half are short distance migrants, and then the next year it's 80-20 in some direction, we can know either something went really wrong in one population or really right in another. And with these long-lived birds that take some time to make that full journey, it's usually a clue that something has gone wrong in one of the populations, whether it's a lower return rate because of issues they had on migration, issues they're having in the wintering ground. Normally, as would kind of be intuitive, we're more worried about some of these long-distance migrant populations just because they're the ones who have this really tight timing to be able to make this journey. And by collecting those feathers and getting them analyzed and able to see what percentage of our Delaware Bay birds are long versus short distance migrants, and then tracking that over time, we're able to pull a lot of really valuable kind of population level and species level insights from that. And then just from reciting these birds, both within our project and from people who submit us recites throughout the year, we can start to understand better year-to-year return rates to a certain stopover, site fidelity, age, and just different patterns in the birds' movements. Are there birds that are consistently late arrivers, consistently early arrivers, things like that, that do end up, when you multiply them over a huge scale, having some really interesting implications. I didn't do too much with this slide. I just like looking at tracking data, so I thought you guys would too. So this was some of our Ready Turnstone tag data from 2 years ago. So this was, we tagged 12 birds, I think only 8, we had some issues the first year of our tags. I think this is about 8 tags that worked for at least a good while. And so here you can see kind of a tighter in Delaware Bay movement for our turnstone. And you notice they're really centered, and those red dots, you know, are the first point from a given tag. So all these birds were tagged in and around Mispillion Harbor. A lot of them spent time around Fowler Beach at Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge, in that back shore area and on the front beach. A lot of them love we found that pretty much all of our turnstones seem to roost overnight at the breakwalls off of Cape Henlopen State Park, which has been really interesting because we're not out there at night. We wouldn't have known. We kind of figured because turnstone like rocks, but now we know for sure pretty much every bird flies from Mispillion to the breakwall off Cape every night. And then some birds end up further north in like Bombay Hook and Bowers and a couple other odd spots that aren't nearly as much of a hot spot for these guys as some of those further south locations you can see. Here's another just look at some of the types of figures and analyses that we can generate just from our raw data. So one of our most useful figures to look at immediately after the season is at that far end, and that's our weight relative to previous years. So because this project's been going on so long, taking catches, you know, every couple of days for season after season after season, we just plot, you know, if we caught birds on the 15th, we plot the weight of those birds against every other bird caught on the 15th, which at this point in the project is hundreds of birds. So we can see relative to the kind of place in the month, how our individual species weights are compared to previous years. This year, so some of those odd dots that you see that don't fit from this year, those were from much smaller catches and walk-in traps and things, so they don't necessarily work with the stats. But this year for turnstone and a lot of other birds, what we were seeing was average to slightly above average weights in the beginning of the season, and then dropping to average to slightly below average in the later half of the season, and we found that that seemed to be associated with big drop in water temperature, because we had a ton of bad rainstorm days, and crab spawning in the harbor dramatically slowed down in the middle of the season. So they were probably able to get less fat as quickly in the middle of that season, and a lot of birds just stayed longer than we expected. Hopefully as many stayed long as needed to fatten up. But this was definitely a bit of a problematic year for food sources. On both sides of the bay with that water temperature, but Delaware's coast seems to be particularly sensitive to that. We don't have as many shallow areas, so our temperature can drop off really quickly. This middle image is just raw flock counts at one of our sites. I believe this is Brockenbridge, Delaware Wildlands property. And this is just something that we would look at to see what species use this area, when do they tend to peak, where do they tend to be moving around to. So you can just see in the color coding, there's different species tend to arrive at different times, prioritize other sites, things like that. And then just to look at our migratory connectivity is a way to put this, this is related to the colors of those flags that we saw. I believe this was 2024 data that I pulled for this one. And the flag colors are associated with the countries that they were put out on. So you see for turnstone, there's been a good amount of flagging of turnstone in Brazil recently, and we were seeing a lot of those birds. So we're able to report back to those projects and say, hey, the bird you banded, you know, this February made it to Delaware by this date. And that can be really useful for other researchers' studies. Or if they're doing tagging projects and they're trying to, you know, understand if their tag dropped off or if their bird died, if we see it here and we're able to report to them, that really changes the look of and the accuracy of a lot of these data. Taking a look back at some of our population and level implications of the work that we do, this is a look at our peak counts from aerial surveys for red knot and ruddy turnstone, red knot in the blue, turnstone in the yellow. So these are from those aerial single day flight counts, and we take the maximum from each one. We also in recent years have started doing ground and boat counts at the same time to sort of back up the flight data, because the flight data very observer dependent, very weather and condition dependent. Sometimes it was nice to be able to have those ground counts to back up the aerial, and then the aerial's able to get to more areas than necessarily observers can. So you can see a pretty clear demarcation from maybe pre-horseshoe crab and shorebird crash levels to recently. It's always a pretty variable data set, partially because the number of birds in the bay is a pretty variable thing, and also just because timing a peak aerial count 2 months ahead of time, we're not able to say, I think, you know, we've got the most birds we've seen so far this year, let's tell the pilot to take us out now. These dates are picked ahead of time. We're probably not always hitting peak, and then sometimes we're probably hitting it perfectly. So some variation is expected, and we tend to like to look at the 3-year moving average of this data, which has shown relatively stable, but you know, you can see it's up and down all over the place. This year was a pretty solid year for both species. We did find that almost entire red knot population on the Jersey side, a bit more of an even split when it comes to turnstone. Oh, and we did compile and publish a full report of this data this year with New Jersey, myself, and Fish and Wildlife Service that goes through all the changing methodologies over the year, all of the historic data. Sometimes there's, this was just highlighting red knot, and so it doesn't go into other things. But if you're curious about these surveys, this has all those moving averages. This has the breakdown between the states going back from when these surveys started, and all the different ways and observer changes that have affected those counts over time. Because we love that long-term data set, but there are some consistency issues across it. Other big use of our data each year is our red knot data, and the data collected in New Jersey gets incorporated into a passage population model, and that's used to try to estimate the number of birds that came through the bay in total, not just on a single day. And we use this kind of image of a funnel to think about the bay is constantly getting and losing birds throughout that month of May. There is no single day where every bird that came to the bay in spring stopover is there to be counted. So using this model, primarily using flag resites and mark to unmarked ratios, we try to understand, based on those ratios and extrapolations to the population level, when kind of arrival rates peak, stabilize, and then departure rates peak, and that's our bay filling and emptying. And we're able to use that to get an estimated population model and then an interval that it's likely to actually fall into. And we're also able to calculate things like stopover duration during that, which can be useful for understanding how long birds are sticking around and what the implications of that might be. These reports are all also published. This analysis is run by Jim Lyons at USGS every year, and those get published as soon as the full data approval process is done, which hasn't been done yet for the 2025 data, because I don't know if you've noticed some funky stuff going on with federal government processes, but it slowed down the report publishing for this one. I've seen it, it's great, but it's not public yet. We have all these reports, the recent reports and that last aerial study report linked on the DNREC Shorebird Research and Monitoring page, if you just wanted the one-stop shop for a bunch of links. Here's a look at some of that data that is in that report through 2024. This is like a table that gets updated in that report every year, showing the passage population estimates as well as the aerial count for that year. So you can see 2024, it was around 46,000. With that interval there, the intervals tend to have a lot of overlap with each other, is what we use to conclude that it's a relatively stable population. Again, goes up and down somewhat every year, depending how much data is collected. Sometimes the interval of likelihood is wider. And then it's also paired with that peak count data for the aerial surveys.
Is this all birds or just red knot?
This is just red knot. There is an analysis underway for the turnstone data actively. Jim's also doing that, he's a busy guy. So what we've been seeing, as if you're taking a look here, this doesn't look like a clear trajectory of population recovery. We do expect some variation and noise in this data because we are just one stopover in a network of stopovers. Birds aren't all, the full population is not able to be measured by what comes into Delaware Bay, and that percentage might be different every year. But no matter how you slice it, this is not overwhelming conservation success story going on right now. Our feather isotope studies from both sides of the bay don't show a difference in, one population's survival over another. So why is this stable not increasing is something that we've all been asking ourselves, and it's a complicated answer with a lot of unknowns still active. So horseshoe crab availability was, and still is, a critical component of the Delaware Bay stopover, and was kind of the clear culprit in the massive declines we saw in the early 2000s. Now the story seems a little more complicated. We saw an initial population recovery as fishery management efforts started, and then the horseshoe crabs seem to have continued having some population recovery, which is displayed here from a recent summary paper. This went through 2023's data, but the trend from the more recent reports has continued to be fluctuating, but positive, where the shorebirds have stagnated. So based on all the trawl data that we have, multiple different types of methods, multiple areas covered, the compiled average is going up for shorebirds, for horseshoe crabs, but shorebirds don't seem to be experiencing that same level of recovery. We have to look at it at multiple scales. So the shorebirds are only here for a couple of weeks of their full year and their full, worldwide range. So we have to consider ourselves as a critical component of that stopover, but also have some humility in, the other things that can be affecting these populations. So I split this up into sort of full annual cycle, non-Delaware Bay specific threats that we're dealing with, and then I'll go into some of our Delaware Bay specific threats in a second. Big thing, climate change and global warming is affecting the timing of everything. I'll go into specifically in a second horseshoe crab spawning timing versus shorebird arrival, but timing at the breeding grounds is changing more rapidly than it ever would have at any evolutionary time scale. The birds need to time their arrival into the Arctic when the permafrost and the ground is not frozen, but not so late that predators have increased and all these things, and that window is just constantly shifting in a way that these birds are not going to be fit to adapt to with their long generation times. Changes in predator composition at the breeding grounds, range expansion of a lot of mammalian predators as temperatures warm, quality of stopovers both on the northbound and southbound routes, as coastal development and all sorts of habitat degradation and fragmentation go on. Threats at wintering grounds or during their migratory route. There's a lot of shorebird hunting in the Caribbean and South America still that, none of these things individually are probably population level threats. These are all probably little needles that are just overall working together to suppress these populations. Habitat loss on the wintering grounds, and again, predator expansions, increases of human-associated predators in all these different areas that can be really rough on the shorebird roost and decrease the quality of that habitat for them. Delaware specific and Delaware Bay specific, changing climate, changing temperatures are affecting the timing of when horseshoe crabs spawn, and red knot and a lot of these long distance migrants are operating on such a tightly controlled system where it is so easy for a mismatch to have catastrophic effects. So, if they miss peak spawning by 10 days, that may take a huge chunk out of the population that's able to make it to the breeding grounds and successfully breed. That's not one that we necessarily can as easily control directly, but there are things that we can think about to try to mitigate that based on creating different types of coastal habitat where maybe waters would warm more quickly. That seems to be possibly one of the factors contributing to Jersey still being a preferable red knot foraging habitat. It's a lot more shallower beach. Red knot don't spawn. Horseshoe crabs spawn there just earlier enough that it seems to be kind of bridging that gap with the changing phenology situation there, that Delaware doesn't have as many of these shallow beaches. There's been a lot of beach erosion in recent years and degradation of some of our gentler sloping coastlines to where horseshoe crabs are not spawning as early in Delaware in good feeding areas as they have in the past. Loss and degradation of roost habitat, again, slightly more relevant in Delaware. The New Jersey coastline's got a lot more protected land, just more area in general, where there seems to be satisfactory marsh roosts for some of these birds like red knot that are really particular about their roost habitat. Our turnstone just love those rocks. They're never gonna be bothered by, foxes in their marshes. But a lot of our marshes are being affected by sea level rise, and they're hemmed in from the back by development. That's a big situation. I mean, big kind of common thread here anywhere, but definitely in Delaware, is marshes and beaches are meant to be dynamic habitats. They're not the most stable habitats. They are meant to kind of come and go with storms and be able to move, but with human development, we've hemmed them in. So when a beach erodes, that sand's not necessarily moving to an area where a shorebird foraging area can form. It might be moving in front of, I don't know, like the Rehoboth Boardwalk or something, where it's never gonna be hosting 40,000 shorebirds. That's outside the bay, but beside the point. We also consider, as part of that, disturbance on our beaches. Again, even if we have open beach habitat, not every open beach habitat is valid for a massive shorebird foraging event, because we have properties going right up to our beaches. We have active beach recreation, off-leash dogs, things like that that might prevent foraging from occurring there at all. Or if a flock does land there to try to forage, they're going to be wasting energy every 5 minutes, flushing off the ground, running away from people and dogs, and just wasting a lot of that energy that they're here to store up. And that could also be contributing. Jersey's also got us beat there. They've got a lot more sections of closed beach, partially just the way that some of their land access things worked out, and just also because of as a result of the really strong conservation activism there to be able to close those beaches. Delaware, we're in a trickier spot because we do have more limited coastline that's public, and that's usually what you're most able to buy out and close, and then there becomes kind of an environmental access and justice issue there, where if most of the beach is owned by a certain class and have private areas, and then we start closing everything public, does that just restrict beach access by class? So that's something that we have to think about as well, of trying to balance the needs of our full system, and it just adds a political element there that is always present in conservation, but definitely in this work in particular. So if you've digested all of that and you're wondering how you can get involved, personally, everybody minimizing their disturbance around migration times. Everybody here is, a wildlife person and probably fully aware of this, but keeping the purpose of some of these habitats in mind, even when we're birding or doing photography or things like that. For migrating shorebirds, foraging flocks, ideally giving them as much space as possible is really helpful to that situation. And when you can, in a low conflict way, encouraging others to do the same. You could join our project team. I'll send out the link to the interest form to join our existing survey team, whether you want to come see how catches work and help out with that, whether you want to be helping out with counts, or even just helping out around the house. We've got a field house full of people doing equipment maintenance, entering data, things like that, and there's usually a mix of things that can be done when people come by. Critically though, I have a pitch. This whole thing has actually been building to asking you guys for something. A mystery third option is, we would love if Delaware had a shorebird stewardship program to encourage people to kind of obey the rules of our existing beach closures, as few and far between as they are, and encourage just good shorebird friendly behavior on the areas that aren't closed. It's not necessarily something our team has the capacity to add into our existing workload, which was everything I've just been talking about. We don't really have the ability for me to run a different volunteer program at the exact same time as the volunteer program we're already running. So I've been talking to Joe about the idea of maybe having there be some kind of DOS-led initial effort to get some more community support and stewardship efforts on some of these beaches where it seems like it would have the most effect. This is partially inspired by a coast-wide effort being led by a group at Virginia Tech that's been applying the framework of community-based social marketing to benefit shorebird conservation, specifically beach nesting bird areas and migratory shorebirds, in order to get voluntary positive engagement with the community that also benefits birds and conservation. So we were wondering if there'd be anybody interested, potentially, in doing some volunteer public ambassador work at a few of these critical areas during just peak times in May when we think it'll have the most impact. So essentially it would be like weekends in May, around Memorial Day, and other weekends around then. and primarily thinking about Bowers Beach and Slaughter Beach. That's kind of where the perfect storm of a lot of people and a lot of actual potential for good foraging area occur. Bowers, we've, as of last year, been able to close a section of beach, so the job there would probably be to stand near that closed section of beach at the fence with a scope, with a camera or whatever, talking to folks, explaining why the closure's there, and hopefully by your presence, discouraging people from walking straight in. Slaughter, we don't have closed areas, and they do not want us to have closed areas, and we will not have closed areas anytime soon. But just being an educational ambassador about the birds, explaining to people what they're looking at, and helping them care a little more, and then where possible, encouraging better behavior in relation to birds. Walk around a flock, leash a dog, don't necessarily, walk all the way to the end where there's 3,000 birds foraging when you could turn around 50 feet earlier and not flush those birds. If this was something that we had a bit of interest in, I would absolutely love it, and we could totally provide the support and materials. I could lead a training related to, communication in these situations and de-escalation. It's something we deal a lot with our piping plover closures. But this would be a new program that would just be targeting those couple of hot spots in May to maybe keep disturbance even just a little bit lower for these birds. They've got so little time here that honestly anything can have a big effect. So we'd be interested in finding out if people would be interested in participating as volunteers, and also anybody who's interested in willing to coordinate those volunteers to say, who's available when, who can show up from 9 to 12, things like that. Should just be for a couple days over the month, so it would be a fairly limited time commitment. And if we have some people and some buy-in here, the Dare Lab has really been wanting to get involved in Delaware Bay programs and is applying for a grant currently to support programs like this in Delaware. New Jersey as well, but they're particularly interested in Delaware because we've had so little in the way of, during the season public education, that I've been working with them on a grant to just provide a small amount of financial support that could potentially pay a volunteer coordinator going forward, whether it was somebody from among your own membership who just gets a part-time internship to run this program. It could be a student, it could be great experience for someone early career getting into this field, leading some kind of conservation project, or just somebody who's interested. They've also got a lot of existing educational material, volunteer communication tactics, and things that they've been able to test throughout similar areas to this to see what actually increases, the positive public attitude and decreases negative behaviors. So it wouldn't necessarily just be us seeing what sticks. There is some, pre-studied evidence to what's been working for people in the post-COVID kind of crazy people on beaches years that we've been having. So I'll be passing around a link, I guess, to you guys' email list of an interest form, and I put a lot of options in there of just you don't know if you're interested, but you just want to stay in the loop, all the way to I'm willing to volunteer and I'm happy to coordinate everybody else too. So really whatever level or degree that you feel interested in this type of program, I'd love to hear about it, and it would be great to have you guys as a partner in this work. In addition to anyone who's interested in joining in the existing work we have going on, it's not an either-or situation. We'd love to have people as involved as possible. And that's about all I've got. I mentioned all those papers that I mentioned can be found on our website, and also a lot of information in Sally's article, and feel free to contact me at any point with follow-up questions or whatever.
That's great. Give the Dare Lab my email,
Okay. Yeah.
and I'll make sure that it gets out to the membership and connected to, we have to maybe enlist some of our youth birders in this project.
Well, yeah, that'd be good.
We have some Q&A, Mike?
Yeah, I just a couple points. I think you might be selling yourself a little short on the conservation victory aspect. I mean, preventing a decline.
Yeah.
I would argue
it
is a
majorly
victory.
stabilized.
The other thing is, because these are such long-lived birds, they tend to have relatively low reproductive rates, and so I'm not sure you really could expect an instant sort of rebound. I mean, it's going to take a long time to really see the effect reflected in the population.
Yeah,
so,
we expect significant lag. I would say that just even range-wide, we're not seeing the recovery that we'd hope to see with the changes that we put in place, and just with the increase but it just means there's more motivation to figure out what's going on, because clearly there's other elements that we aren't addressing, because the things that we do know about,
But you may
aren't
be more
necessarily lining up.
successful than you think because of that
Yeah,
lag.
yeah. There might be more birds coming. Who knows?
Is there similar lag time with the maturity of the horseshoe crab? I heard
The
they-
horseshoe crab are slow to mature as well, so that's part of the survey protocols when they're out there physically sampling for the horseshoe crabs, is they are age staged and sexed. And so that goes into the model to understand, you know, how these things project forward.
So the upward was the.
That was the
mature-
overall
oh,
summary
total.
of the total Delaware Bay Area population with all those age stage kind of corrections
Okay, so
figured in.
normalized
Yeah.
for, okay.
Yeah, there's the full paper has the full age
All right,
staging
very
data in
good.
it as well.
Do we have short-term or short distance or long distance migrants stop by, or all of them?
It's for the like shorebird specifically. Yeah, it's a mix. It's a mix, and they tend to kind of arrive in clumps. It seems like a lot of times the long distance migrants, at least recently, have been arriving first. We don't know if it's just the way that they cue into their migration time might be a little different. But the percentage has been around about stable, and it's pretty evenly split for us with red knot. We only do that analysis with red knot, but other species don't nearly go as far. Red knot have very distinct wintering populations, whereas for things like ruddy turnstone, they're all kind of around the Caribbean and that east coast of South America. And I don't know if you'd be able to separate wintering populations as cleanly by isotope as you can with the red knot, but we have a pretty even mix here.
Do you know about the Red Knot Fest in Slaughter Beach?
Yes,
Would
yes.
be a good place to recruit for your
Yeah,
stewardship for
yeah,
the-
we were able to send people there some years, but we're always a bit of a, it gets chaotic in that house, I don't know.
I'm gonna be there, and probably a few other
Cool,
DOS members, Mary Braun and Scott Northey, our
Yeah.
vice president,
Yeah.
and Declan O'Neill, who's also on council. You were there last year. We
Yeah, I
kinda
don't
got
think
hit by
we-
the storm, so it
I was
wasn't.
gonna say, I think we had some people interested in going last year, and then it was a storm
Yeah.
situation.
But it's actually, it's a great opportunity, and the people that come there really appreciate just being next to somebody with a scope,
Yep.
learning a few things.
Yeah.
They're clueless. They just, you run into people, oh, my dog just loves to set the birds up flying, and it's like, did
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, you can usually do a lot of impact in a relatively short time in some of
Yeah.
these areas, yeah.
Last 2 years, have you seen any effects of avian influenza in the shorebird population?
Not that we've been able to notice in the shorebird population, but we're dealing with such big numbers there, and we're dealing with post-migration birds. You would probably be that we're probably not seeing, you know, very ill birds successfully arrive in the Delaware Bay. There is probably some degree that they're carrying it, and there is some evidence that those birds have then been passing that avian influenza on to like our peregrine sightings in Delaware and New Jersey went down a lot last year compared to recent years. And probably they're getting hit with the avian influenza that they may be getting from shorebirds. We did participate in an influenza study last year, collecting samples primarily from ruddy turnstone for us, because that's what we were able to get blood and swabs from most easily. And none of our birds that we tested were positive. We didn't test a huge number, it was probably 30 or so, but out of a random sample from early part of the season, we had no positive hits. But there's definitely an impact in the ecosystem as a whole. I wouldn't say it's obvious from what we see in the bay, what's going on there with them. The shorebirds seem to get and be good hosts for influenza more often than they die from it, which then just means they pass it on to other species that may be more effective, or just, you know, the population structure of your raptors like peregrines, dramatically different than the population structure of shorebirds, where much smaller populations, relatively small things like a virus that only kills, you know, 1% of infected birds is gonna be a lot more obvious in a peregrine population than, you know, shorebirds.
You're working with the St. Jude's group on that?
We were working directly with Dee Prosser at USGS, and it was a multi-lab
Okay.
collaboration, so
Okay.
it's possible that was
Yeah.
connected to. I was mainly working with USGS and the people at SCWDS, Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study.
Moving away from red knots, I have been impressed by the decline in numbers of Dunlin.
Yeah,
And they have a different sort of niche than
yeah.
turnstones. And any thoughts there? Is this the same deal
I
happening?
don't necessarily have as many specific thoughts on Dunlin. It's just more that all of these species have been declining and red knot have been kind of the umbrella species that a lot of this conservation was done in the name of, because they are the most specialist, had the most significant declines related to horseshoe crabs, and have just proven to be the most sensitive to a lot of environmental changes, more so than other shorebirds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other shorebirds are not also doing poorly. As red knot have shifted away from Delaware, our project has spent more time answering these kind of big analysis questions about other species. So our turnstone, sanderling, and now dowager are things that we're interested in doing detailed population analysis with, because they're all declining. Even the ones that are more generalist are not doing well. Red knot would probably always be the most sensitive, and they're just striking to look at. They're a great conservation ambassador, but all of these species could use a lot more questions answered than we currently have. So we've been kind of trying to broaden our scope there.
You're allowed to decline to answer this question, but are your thoughts about whether a complete ban on horseshoe crab harvesting rather than just allowing a male harvest, would that make a difference here, or is this too complicated?
It's tough, because I think from a conservation person's point of view, like, I'm always going to be kind of pro, some kind of limitations on things, but when looking at the full system and what we see on the ground here, I don't necessarily feel like that's the most effective use of our effort and political power, and that it would have the desired effect. And the overall cost-benefit analysis of it on society as a whole, that is an industry that would be negatively affected, and I just don't know if we would see the effect on birds that we would necessarily like to see. It's a little hazy. I can't say for sure that wouldn't have a massive effect or a marginal one. I would say from looking on the ground and what we get as far as spawning areas where we have a lot of spawning and a lot of other shorebirds, but not a single red knot, to me, I think at least for red knot, habitat issues are Delaware's bigger problem, seeing as we're able to support large populations of other species, and all the red knot are hanging out in Jersey. And it would seem to me that if they were low on food source in Jersey, they'd red knot fly across the bay like it's, they're just going to the kitchen to get a snack. They don't come to Delaware even really to scout in significant numbers in the last few years. It seems like if these birds were struggling to find food and habitat on one side, there'd be a little bit more moving around, and then birds not coming back year after year. The Jersey population the last couple of years, peak counts, individual birds recited, all these metrics have increased the last few years. That's not what you'd expect if birds didn't have enough to eat. These birds have a network of stopover locations they can use. They're coming back to Delaware and actually occupying narrower and narrower habitats. Doesn't spell great things for that other habitat, but they've probably got enough food where they're at.
Which kind of dovetails that we've got a question on the live chat, the live stream. It says, how many red knots are leaving at breeding condition weight? If they recall correctly, there's a threshold weight considered heavy enough to be in breeding.
Yeah, that's the P180 analysis, and the kind of determination of that threshold was a little before my time, and I don't remember all the ins and outs of how that was determined to be what it is considered to be. I'm not as familiar with that data on our side because we've had too few birds to run that analysis in the entire time I've been here, and for a year or two before that. So as far as Delaware data, I can't really speak to that. This year we caught 7 red knot, so we were not trying to run weight thresholds on our 7 red knot. Statistically, wouldn't have meant a thing. Yeah.
New Jersey reported only 40% reached the target weight this year.
Okay.
Wow.
Thanks.
Have you thought about doing a fall migration study?
I personally do, but it's a lot of ground to cover. So me and my team, since I've gotten here, have instituted that as a more solid protocol. We pretty much just go back to the same sites that we do our spring migration study at to understand how the same sites are being used at a different part of the year by different species. I've been putting more effort and more survey frequency into that every year, but if more people want to get involved, that's certainly something we could do. That's a less intensely structured period of time because we're getting much smaller numbers of birds over a longer period of time, but I tend to go try to revisit all these sites once every 1 to 2 weeks from like end of July to beginning of October and get counts again. And then we get different species composition, as you all know, in the fall migration than the spring migration. A lot more black-bellied brook plovers, a lot more semi-plovers, and fewer of these other species that we get in the spring.
Sounds like a citizen science project.
There's
Once
al-
you're done
there's
with white
always
clay. Any more questions, either this audience or online?
Great.
Kat, that was
Thanks
great.
very much.
Yeah, it was
Thank you.
fantastic, and thank you for coming, and make sure you get some volunteers. You get each one. All right, and the announcement will be going out, but it's May 16th, isn't that right?